The steppe stretches wide and endless, grass rolling like waves beneath the open sky. The wind never stops here. It rushes across the land, bending the grass, shaking the felt tents of herders, and carrying with it the cries of horses. Winter freezes this earth into stone. Summer burns it dry, and yet families survive, moving with their herds, drinking milk and riding across rivers that cut through the emptiness. It was from this place, a land most kings would never dare to rule, that a people rose who would shape the fate of the world. They were not born in stone cities or behind tall walls. They carried no gold, no marble statues, no temples of carved stone. They lived in simple tents, slept on furs, and followed their herds from one pasture to the next. To the kingdoms around them, they seemed wild, divided, and poor. But in this world of wind and grass, strength was not in stone or silver. It was in speed, discipline, and the will to endure. This is the story of the Mongols, a people who began as scattered tribes and became masters of the largest land empire in history. Their horses thundered from the Pacific Ocean to the edges of Europe. Their riders carried fear into every city they approached. Their leaders brought new laws, new trade routes, and new order to lands that had never been joined before. Yet their power did not last forever. The same fire that built their empire burned it down from within. At the heart of this story stands one man, Temujin, later known as Genghis Khan. Born into hardship, betrayed by allies, hunted by enemies, he rose from nothing to command all the tribes of the steppe. He taught loyalty through fear, but also rewarded courage with honor. He valued skill above birth, discipline above wealth. Under his rule, the Mongols became more than riders. They became a storm that rolled across kingdoms and deserts, leaving both ruin and wonder in its path. But the story is not only of victory, it is also of mistakes, greed, and division. After the greatest conquests came struggles for power. After unity came quarrels. After the height of empire came cracks, decline, and loss. The Mongol Empire, like all empires before and after, rose with fire and fell with shadows. As we walk through this tale, we will not only follow their rise and fall, we will also ask, what if the Mongol Empire had never ended? Imagine a modern superstate stretching across Asia and Europe, built on the same discipline and speed, ruling through one law and one order. Would the world today be safer or more fearful? Would we see more unity or more tyranny? We will also meet their leaders, both great and terrible. Some ruled with vision and justice, lifting their people to greatness. Others wasted power with pride and carelessness, leaving only destruction behind. From them, lessons remain about strength and weakness, about what holds nations together and what tears them apart. So let us begin. Let us ride into the vast grasslands where the story starts. Let us follow the life of a boy who would become Genghis Khan, and then the thunder of armies that followed him. Let us watch an empire rise higher than any before it, and then watch it fall into dust. This is the rise and fall of the Mongol Empire. How they built power, how they lost it, and what their story still whispers to us today. The Mongol world began with the steppe, a land without walls, a land without borders, a land that seemed endless under the eternal blue sky. In every direction stretched open grass, rolling hills and wide valleys cut by rivers. No city stood here with stone towers or carved gates. There were no markets filled with silver coins, no temples decorated with painted walls. There was only earth, sky, wind, and people who moved with their animals. Life here was not gentle. Winters froze the ground solid, with snow falling in storms that blinded both men and beasts. Families huddled together in felt tents, burning dried dung to keep warm. Summers were harsh in another way, with scorching sun and little shade. Dust storms rolled across the plains, yet the people endured. The steppe taught them strength, and strength kept them alive. Families lived in round felt tents called gers. A ger could be taken apart, loaded on carts and carried by camels or oxen to a new camp. Nothing was fixed. Everything was ready to move. A family might move several times each year, following pasture for their herds. Sheep and goats gave wool and milk. Horses gave not only milk and meat, but also freedom. Camels and cattle carried heavy loads. Wealth was measured in animals, not in coins. To lose a herd meant ruin. To gain more meant honor and power. Horses were the true lifeblood of the Mongols. A child learned to ride before he could speak many words. Boys and girls both sat on ponies, guiding them across the grasslands. By the time they were 10, children could race at full speed, shoot from horseback, and round up animals. Horses were friends, food, and weapons. A rider could sleep on horseback, travel for days with little food, and shoot arrows in any direction while galloping. Without horses, there would be no Mongols, and without Mongols, history would look very different. The steppe tribes were many. Each clan had its own leader, its own warriors, and its own pastures. A Khan might rule a tribe, but his power was never safe. Alliances shifted like the wind. A family might swear loyalty one year and break it the next. Betrayal was common, and revenge was a duty passed from father to son. Raids were constant. At night, riders could appear from the horizon, burn tents, steal herds, and vanish before dawn. Every family kept watch, always ready to flee or fight. Steppe warfare was fast, unlike the slow sieges of cities. 100 riders could strike a camp in minutes, circling their enemies, loosing arrows, retreating, and attacking again. To outsiders, it seemed like chaos. To the Mongols, it was art. They trained their children to ride and shoot until it became second nature. Their ponies were small but strong, able to survive on little grass, carrying warriors across deserts and frozen rivers alike. Religion shaped their view of life and death. They worshipped the eternal blue sky, the vast dome above them, and honored spirits in mountains, rivers, and trees. Shamans spoke to the unseen world, guiding families with prayers and rituals. The steppe people feared offending spirits but trusted in the sky's protection. Their faith gave comfort, but it did not bind them into one nation. Each clan had its own sacred places and its own guides. Children grew up quickly in this world. They learned that nothing was safe, that food could run out, that friends could turn into enemies. They were taught to be strong, to endure pain without tears, to share what little they had, and to remember every wrong done to them. Life on the steppe was a school of hardship. Only the toughest survived, and only the wisest could lead. To outsiders, kings in China, princes in Persia, merchants from distant lands, the Mongols and their neighbors looked like scattered bands of wanderers. They saw no cities, no great treasures, only tents and herds. They believed the steppe people were too divided to matter. Yet they were mistaken, for the qualities the steppe demanded, endurance, speed, discipline, and suspicion of weakness, were exactly the qualities that under the right leader could become the foundation of empire. It was in this hard and restless world that a boy named Temujin was born. His father was a Khan, respected but not powerful enough to rule all the tribes. Temujin's childhood would soon be marked by betrayal, loss, and suffering. Yet the lessons of the steppe, the endless horizon, the riding, the hunger, the loyalty of friends, and the sting of betrayal, all these would shape him. From this land that seemed barren to kings would rise the man who would change the destiny of continents. The world of the steppes gave the Mongols nothing easily, but it gave them everything they needed to rise. Temujin, the boy who would become Genghis Khan, was born into the wild heart of the steppe. His birth, around the year 1162, was not marked by grand ceremony. There were no palaces, no written records, only a family camp with felt tents, herds grazing, and a father who carried the title of Khan among his people. The steppe was his cradle, the eternal blue sky his roof. From the very start, his life would be shaped by both fortune and hardship. Temujin's father, Yasuge, was a respected chieftain of the Borjigin clan. He was known as a strong warrior, clever in making alliances, but also aware of the endless rivalries between tribes. When Temujin was a young child, his father arranged for him to be betrothed to Berta, the daughter of another noble family. Among the steppe people, such bonds were important for survival. A marriage was not just a union of two people, but a link between clans, a promise of mutual support. But fortune turned quickly. When Temujin was still a boy, Yasuge was poisoned while attending a feast with another tribe. Betrayal was never far on the steppe, and this act tore apart the fragile safety of Temujin's family. Without the strength of Yasuge to protect them, the Borjigin clan abandoned the widow Hoylan and her children. Overnight, Temujin's family went from being respected to being outcasts, left to starve in the wilderness. The steppe did not show mercy. Hoylan gathered her children and tried to keep them alive. They dug for roots, caught fish, hunted small animals, and ate wild berries. Temujin learned hunger as his first teacher. He learned that survival did not come from pity, but from effort. His mother's strength left a deep mark on him. She told her children that unity was their only weapon. If they fought each other, they would die. If they stood together, they might survive. Yet even within his own family, tension grew. Temujin's half-brother Beta, older and stronger, tried to claim leadership over the family. The rivalry turned violent. In a dark moment of his youth, Temujin and his younger brother Kasar killed better. It was a shocking act, but it showed the fierce will of a boy who would not accept weakness or the loss of control. On the steppe, such choices were cruel, but they were born of necessity. Leadership meant survival. As Temujin grew, he faced another trial. He was captured by the Taichi Ud, a rival clan. They bound him with a wooden collar and treated him as a slave. But Temujin's spirit was not broken. He waited, watched, and when the chance came, he escaped with the help of a sympathetic guard. This experience taught him more than the pain of chains. It taught him patience, cunning, and the value of turning even enemies into allies. Slowly, Temujin began to rebuild his strength. He gathered followers, men who were tired of betrayal and chaos. What set him apart was not only his courage, but his fairness. He rewarded men for loyalty and skill, not simply for their family name. In a world where nobility was usually inherited, this was new. Warriors who felt overlooked by other leaders found in Temujin a man who recognized their worth. At the same time, he remembered the betrayal that had destroyed his father. He never forgot that safety could vanish in a single feast, that alliances could dissolve overnight. This memory made him cautious and relentless. He would not trust lightly. He demanded absolute loyalty, and in return, he offered protection and honor. Through these struggles, a boy of the steppe was turning into a leader. Hunger, betrayal, captivity, and bloodshed were harsh teachers, but they gave Temujin the qualities that would later make him feared and respected across the world. He learned that survival required unity, that leadership required discipline, and that mercy was dangerous when enemies waited to strike. The childhood of Temujin was no fairy tale. It was a story of loss, of wandering through the cold, of a family on the edge of death. Yet it was also the forging of iron in fire. The boy who dug roots from frozen ground would one day command armies that stretched from China to Europe. The boy who carried the memory of his father's betrayal would one day create laws to bind his people together. The boy who once wore a slave's collar would one day be called Genghis Khan, the ruler of nations. The steppe was a place of endless rivalry. Every tribe guarded its herds, every Khan wanted power, and every insult demanded revenge. For generations, the clans of Mongolia fought each other without end. Sometimes they made alliances, but these often broke apart within months. In this world of shifting loyalties, only one thing seemed certain. No tribe could ever control them all. Temujin, the young man who had survived betrayal, hunger, and captivity, believed otherwise. He had learned that survival required more than courage. It required unity. If the tribes could stop fighting one another and turn their strength outward, nothing could resist them. But to unite such people was no easy task. It meant breaking old traditions and demanding new loyalty. Temujin's first step was to gather men around him, not by blood, but by merit. This was unusual. On the steppe, most leaders gave power to relatives, whether they were capable or not. Temujin looked for talent instead. If a man was loyal, brave, and skilled, he rose in rank, even if he was born poor. If a man betrayed him, even if he was family, Temujin punished him without mercy. This clear sense of reward and discipline attracted followers. Men who had been overlooked by other Khans now found honor under Temujin's banner. One of his most important allies was Jamuka, a childhood friend. At first, they swore loyalty to one another, calling themselves Anda or blood brothers. Together, they dreamed of leading the tribes. But friendship on the steppe was fragile. Jamuka wanted power for himself, and soon rivalry grew between them. Temujin's camp grew larger as more warriors were drawn to his strict but fair leadership. Jamuka, threatened, declared himself Gurkhan, supreme ruler, and the two sides clashed. The war between Temujin and Jamuka was brutal. At one point, Jamuka captured 70 of Temujin's men and executed them by boiling them alive. Such cruelty shocked many and drove them into Temujin's camp. Warriors saw that Jamuka ruled with fear but without justice, while Temujin ruled with both discipline and fairness. Slowly the balance shifted. Temujin's reputation spread. Here was a leader who kept order, who rewarded loyalty, and who punished betrayal. To strengthen his hold, Temujin introduced new laws, later known as the Yasa. These laws gave structure to a world of chaos. They set rules for loyalty, punishment, and the sharing of spoils. They forbade stealing animals from fellow warriors. They punished betrayal with death. They also set rules for military discipline. Soldiers were organized into groups of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000. Each man was responsible for the others in his group. If one failed, all were punished. This strict order made Temujin's army strong, sharper than any other tribes. Temujin also used marriage to strengthen alliances. He married Berta, the woman betrothed to him in childhood, and through her gained the support of her clan. He also arranged marriages between his children and the children of allies. But unlike many Khans, he did not rely only on family ties. His real strength came from loyalty earned through leadership. As his power grew, more tribes submitted to him. Some joined willingly, impressed by his order. Others were defeated in battle and forced to submit. Temujin offered those who surrendered a choice: loyalty and reward, or death. Many chose loyalty, and those who resisted soon felt the speed of his horsemen and the sharpness of his arrows. In 1201, a great council of tribes was called. The rivals who remained declared Jamuka as their leader, while Temujin's supporters gathered around him. War followed, fierce and long, but Temujin's discipline prevailed. By the end of these struggles, Jamuka was betrayed by his own men and delivered to Temujin. Though Jamuka had once been his friend and later his cruel enemy, Temujin showed mercy. Instead of executing him with pain, he allowed Jamuka to die quickly, granting him an honorable end. This act surprised many, but it also showed Temujin's ability to balance justice with mercy. Finally, in 1206, the Great Council of the Steppe, known as a Kurultai, gathered. Leaders from across the tribes came together. There, Temujin was proclaimed Chinggis Khan, Genghis Khan, meaning universal ruler. For the first time, the Mongol tribes stood united under one leader. The endless feuds were set aside, replaced by one law, one banner, and one vision. This unification was not only a turning point for Temujin, but for history itself. The horsemen of the steppe, once divided and dismissed by outsiders, were now bound together as a single nation. Under Genghis Khan, their strength would no longer be wasted on each other. It would be turned outward, against kingdoms and empires that had never before feared the riders of the grasslands. The storm of the Mongols was about to break upon the world. When the tribes of Mongolia finally bent their heads under one banner, the steppe grew quiet in a way it had never known before. The endless raids between clans slowed. The old rivalries no longer tore at the land, and warriors who had once fought one another now rode together. But unity under Genghis Khan was not meant to last in stillness. For him, the uniting of the tribes was not an end, but a beginning. The storm that had been contained within the grasslands was now ready to burst beyond them. The first campaigns of Genghis Khan were aimed at securing his hold over the Mongolian plateau. Although many tribes had submitted, others still resisted in pockets. Rival leaders who had not yet accepted his rule tried to rise against him. Genghis met these threats with both speed and precision. He sent out his cavalry in disciplined units, striking swiftly at rebels, punishing betrayal with death, and rewarding loyalty with gifts of herds and honor. By doing this, he not only destroyed resistance, but also taught the tribes that his rule brought both order and opportunity. To strengthen his army, Genghis continued to refine his system of organization. Soldiers were placed into groups of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000, each with its own commander. Loyalty was owed not only to the Khan, but also to the unit itself. A man was responsible for his brothers, and if one deserted or failed, all shared the punishment. This built unity within the army and made every soldier watchful over his comrades. Discipline became their greatest weapon. One of the earliest tests of this new power came against the Tatars, a long-standing rival tribe. Years earlier, they had poisoned Genghis's father. Now, united and strong, the Mongols struck back. The Tatars were crushed, their leaders executed, and their people absorbed into the Mongol nation. It was both revenge and a warning. Betrayal would never be forgotten. Next came the Merkit, another tribe with whom Genghis had personal history. Years before, when Temujin had first married Berta, the Merkit had raided his camp and stolen her away. Though she had been rescued, the insult remained. Now, with thousands of warriors behind him, Genghis exacted his vengeance. The Merkit were defeated, scattered and absorbed, their power broken. For the Mongols, these victories were not only about conquest, but also about settling the scores of the past. As his armies grew, Genghis began to look beyond Mongolia itself. His eyes turned first to the Jin dynasty in northern China, a wealthy and powerful state that controlled fertile lands and rich cities. The contrast between the steppe and the settled kingdoms could not have been greater. Where the Mongols lived in felt tents, The Chinese lived in walled towns and palaces. Where the Mongols counted wealth in herds, the Chinese counted it in coins, silk, and grain. To the steppe warriors, the riches of the south were almost unimaginable. The first raids into Jin territory tested both sides. The Mongols had speed and discipline, but the Chinese had fortresses, walls, and armies far larger in number. Genghis did not rush blindly. Instead, he learned. He captured engineers and siege experts, forcing them to build machines of war for him. He adapted his tactics, combining the speed of his horsemen with the power of siege weapons. This ability to borrow knowledge from others and make it his own would become one of his greatest strengths. Even while expanding outward, Genghis kept his grip on his own people tight. He issued laws that forbade the kidnapping of women and the stealing of animals, crimes that had once fueled endless tribal wars. He ordered that warriors share loot fairly and that commanders care for their men. These rules reduced internal strife and made his followers feel secure. They trusted that under Genghis, justice, though harsh, was consistent. The early campaigns also built a reputation that spread far beyond Mongolia. News of the Mongols traveled with merchants and refugees. Stories of riders who appeared suddenly, who fought with unmatched discipline, and who punished resistance with fire and sword reached distant lands. Some stories grew into legends, but even the truth was frightening enough. The world was beginning to notice a force that had once been dismissed as mere wanderers. By the end of these first campaigns, the Mongol nation was no longer simply a loose collection of tribes. It had become a war machine, tested in battle, bound by law, and driven by a vision greater than survival. Genghis Khan had turned personal vengeance into national conquest, and local raids into the first steps of empire. The grasslands that had once seemed like the whole world to his people were now only the beginning. The Mongols had tasted victory, and it was not enough to satisfy them. Ahead lay richer lands, greater enemies, and challenges that would test even the discipline of Genghis's army. The first campaigns were only the sharpening of the blade. Soon, that blade would cut into the heart of Asia by the early 13th century. Genghis Khan had united the Mongol steppe and tested his armies in battles against neighboring tribes in the Jin dynasty of China. His warriors were hardened, disciplined, and eager for conquest. Their speed, skill, and loyalty had turned them into the sharpest weapon in Asia. Yet the greatest test of their power was still to come. A clash not with tribes or border lords, but with a wealthy empire that thought itself secure behind its cities and walls. That empire was Khwarezm. The Khwarezm Empire stretched across Central Asia, covering parts of modern Iran, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and beyond. Its cities were rich from trade along the Silk Road. Merchants crowded its markets with silk, spices, jewels, and fine crafts. Its rulers believed themselves strong, confident that nomads from the steppe were no real threat to their cities. But confidence can be a weakness when it blinds a nation to danger. At first, Genghis did not seek war with Khwarezm. He saw trade as useful. The Mongols had horses, furs, and livestock. The cities of Khwarezm had silk, grain, and goods from the Islamic world. Genghis sent a caravan of merchants to establish peaceful exchange. The caravan carried riches and letters of goodwill. It should have been welcomed. Instead, it was destroyed. The governor of Otrar, a border city, accused the Mongol merchants of being spies. He seized their goods, killed many, and sent the survivors in chains. When word reached Genghis Khan, he was shocked but did not rush into war. He sent ambassadors to the Shah of Khwarezm, demanding justice. He asked that the governor of Otrar be punished and the wrongs made right. But the Shah, proud and suspicious, made a fateful choice. He executed one of the Mongol envoys, humiliated the others, and refused to bow to the demands of the steppe ruler. In that moment, peace died. For Genghis Khan, the murder of envoys was unforgivable. To kill messengers was to insult not only the sender, but also the law of nations. It was a betrayal that demanded revenge. Genghis swore that Khwarezm would pay a price so great that the world would never forget. In 1219, the Mongol army rode west. It was not a raid of a few thousand, but a vast host, perhaps 200,000 strong, moving with discipline and speed. Each unit carried its own supplies, engineers, and siege equipment. Scouts ranged ahead, spreading confusion. Messages traveled swiftly through the relay system of horses. The empire that thought it was safe behind its walls was about to face a storm unlike any it had imagined. The campaign began with the siege of Otrar, the city where the caravan had first been betrayed. The Mongols surrounded it, cutting off supplies. They built siege engines, catapults, and towers, using the skills of captured Chinese and Persian engineers. For 5 months the city resisted, but the Mongols pressed on relentlessly. At last, Otrar fell. Its governor was captured and executed in a cruel manner as punishment for his betrayal. The city was destroyed, its people scattered or enslaved. The message was clear: betrayal would be answered with annihilation. From Otrar, the Mongols struck deeper into Khwarezm. They divided their forces, moving swiftly against multiple targets. This confused the defenders, who could not tell where the main attack would fall. Bukhara, one of the great cities of Central Asia, was next. Its people believed their walls would protect them, but the Mongols used siege engines and relentless assaults. When the city fell, Genghis entered not as a mere conqueror, but as a master. Standing in the mosque, he declared, "I am the punishment of God. If you had not committed great sins, God would not have sent a punishment like me upon you." Samarkand, another jewel of Khwarezm, soon faced the same fate. Tens of thousands of defenders resisted bravely, but Mongol discipline and tactics overcame them. The city fell, its treasures taken, its artisans spared to be sent back to Mongolia, and much of the rest of its population destroyed. Genghis had no interest in simply killing. He used terror as a weapon. Survivors were left to spread stories of horror, making other cities surrender without a fight. The Shah of Khwarezm fled, abandoning his people. He retreated across the desert, pursued by Mongol forces, and died in isolation, far from his throne. His empire crumbled without his leadership. City after city fell. Some resisted and were destroyed. Others opened their gates and submitted, hoping to avoid the storm. In less than 2 years, the Khwarezm Empire, once rich and proud, was reduced to ruins. The Mongols showed both cruelty and cunning in this campaign. Entire populations were massacred, but skilled workers, blacksmiths, weavers, scholars, and engineers, were spared and sent east to strengthen Mongol lands. Roads and trade routes were secured. The Silk Road, once interrupted by Khwarezm, was now open under Mongol control. For the world, the destruction of Khwarezm was a shock. No empire had ever fallen so quickly to an enemy that came from the open steppe. Merchants, travelers, and refugees carried stories of the Mongols westward. Some said they were demons, others said they were a scourge sent by God, but all agreed the Mongols were unstoppable. The war against Khwarezm revealed the full power of Genghis Khan's vision. He had turned a people once dismissed as wanderers into an engine of conquest. He had combined the speed of the steppe with the knowledge of siege warfare. He had used fear not only as a weapon on the battlefield, but as a weapon of the mind. Cities fell sometimes before the first arrow was fired, simply out of terror of what the Mongols would do. By the end of the campaign, Central Asia lay shattered. But for the Mongols, this was not the end. It was a door opening to even greater conquests. Persia, Russia, and China all lay ahead. The fall of Khwarezm was only one chapter in the storm. But it was a chapter that showed the world that no empire, no matter how rich or proud, could feel safe. The Mongols had arrived, and the age of their empire had begun. For centuries, the Mongols and their nomadic neighbors had raided the edges of China. They stole horses, cattle, and grain, then disappeared back into the steppe. But these raids were like sparks against stone walls, loud but never lasting. Now, under Genghis Khan, the Mongols had become something different. They were not just raiders. They were an army bound by discipline, driven by vision, and ready to test themselves against one of the richest and most powerful dynasties in the world, the Jin dynasty of northern China. The Jin dynasty controlled vast cities, fertile farmland, and countless soldiers. Its rulers believed they could always handle nomads. After all, they had tall walls, strong fortresses, and a long history of dealing with threats from the north. They thought the Mongols would be no different from the tribes before them. But the Mongols had changed. They no longer fought as scattered clans. They fought as one nation, organized and relentless. The first campaigns against the Jin began as raids, testing the enemy's strength. The Mongols struck quickly, looted supplies, and vanished before larger armies could arrive. But these were not mindless raids. They were lessons. Genghis studied how the Jin armies moved, how their defenses were built, and how their commanders reacted. Every raid was a piece of intelligence, every retreat a preparation for a greater blow. The Mongols soon learned that speed alone would not be enough. The Jin dynasty had strong walls and well-defended cities. To take them, the Mongols needed new tools. Genghis showed one of his greatest strengths. He borrowed knowledge. From captured Chinese and Persian engineers, he learned how to build siege engines. His armies built catapults that hurled stones, towers that rose higher than city walls, and machines that could batter down gates. What they did not know, they forced others to teach them. Step by step, the nomads of the steppe became masters of siege warfare. In 1211, the Mongols launched a full invasion of Jin territory. Tens of thousands of horsemen swept across the Great Wall, using both speed and discipline. They broke through Chinese armies with feigned retreats, luring soldiers into traps, then surrounding them with deadly arrows. The Jin generals, used to slow-moving armies, were confused by the Mongols' sudden strikes and false withdrawals. Again and again, they were tricked into chasing riders who seemed to flee, only to be crushed when the rest of the Mongol army appeared behind them. One of the most famous battles came at Yehuling, the Wild Fox Ridge. Here, the Jin gathered a massive force, far larger than the Mongols. Confident in their numbers, they believed they would finally crush the invaders. But Genghis divided his forces, striking the Jin army in waves, cutting it into pieces, and trapping it in narrow valleys. When the dust settled, the Jin army was shattered, its strength broken. The road into northern China lay open. City after city fell. Some resisted bravely, hoping their walls would hold. The Mongols surrounded them, cutting off supplies, building siege engines, and waiting. Hunger often did the work of arrows. In other places, the mere approach of the Mongol army was enough to make gates swing open. Tales of slaughter spread faster than the riders themselves, and fear often conquered before the first arrow was fired. One city that resisted fiercely was Zhongdu, the great capital of the Jin, known today as Beijing. Its walls were high, its stores full, and its people many. The Mongols surrounded it, built siege machines, and began a long, brutal assault. Arrows rained down, stones smashed against gates, and fires spread through the city. The defenders fought with courage, but after months of siege, the capital fell. The city was looted, burned, and thousands were killed. For the Mongols, it was proof that no city, no matter how strong, could resist them forever. Yet Genghis Khan was not only destruction. In many places he showed pragmatism. Skilled craftsmen, scholars, and administrators were spared and sent east to serve the Mongols. He valued talent as much as loyalty, and he understood that an empire needed more than warriors. It needed builders, thinkers, and record keepers. Through conquest, the Mongols absorbed knowledge that would strengthen their rule. The conquest of northern China was not completed in a single campaign. It stretched over years, with victories, sieges, and shifting alliances. But by the end, the Jin dynasty was broken, its cities taken, its power shattered. The Mongols, once dismissed as mere raiders, had destroyed one of the richest states in Asia. This victory changed more than the map. It changed the Mongols themselves. They were no longer only riders of the steppe. They were rulers of cities, masters of walls, and lords of millions of new subjects. Their empire now included farmers, artisans, merchants, and scholars. With each conquest, their vision of rule grew larger. Genghis Khan had shown that the Mongols could break walls as easily as they broke tribes. The steppe storm had become a hurricane sweeping across kingdoms. For the world beyond, the fall of northern China sent a message louder than any messenger could carry. The Mongols were not just a threat to villages and border towns. They were a power capable of toppling dynasties, of burning capitals, of reshaping entire regions. To rulers in Persia, India, and Europe, whispers of the storm grew into fear. The Mongols were coming, and no one knew where they would stop. The world often remembers Genghis Khan for his battles, the speed of his horsemen, the fall of cities, the rivers of blood left behind. But his rule was not only about conquest. Once he had united the tribes and begun his campaigns, he also began to shape a new kind of order. For the first time in steppe history, there was a leader who dreamed beyond revenge, beyond herds, beyond even the grasslands themselves. Genghis Khan did not just want victory. He wanted to build a system that would last, a vision that stretched further than any horizon. At the heart of his rule was law. Before him, steppe tribes lived by custom and memory. Disputes were settled by force, and justice depended on who had more power. Genghis changed this. He created a code called the Yasa. These laws were not written on paper. They were carried in the memories of his officials and repeated in councils. But they were clear and firm. The Yasa punished betrayal, theft, and cowardice. It set rules for dividing loot, for respecting ambassadors, for protecting women, and for rewarding loyalty. In a world once ruled by chaos, Genghis gave structure. He also built an administration to hold his empire together. Messengers carried orders along a relay system of horses, able to travel hundreds of miles in a few days. A census was taken of people and animals, so that taxes and military service could be counted fairly. Governors were appointed not from noble families, but from men who had proven themselves loyal and capable. This broke old traditions, but built new efficiency. Trade, too, was protected. The Silk Road, once broken by endless raids and bandits, became safe under Mongol patrols. Merchants were given passports stamped with the Khan's seal, guaranteeing their protection as they moved across the empire. Goods flowed more freely than ever before. Silk and porcelain from China, spices from India, glass and textiles from the Islamic world, silver from Europe. The empire became not just a war machine, but a bridge linking civilizations. Religion, often a cause of division in other empires, was treated with tolerance. Genghis himself believed in the eternal blue sky and respected shamans, but he did not force his faith on others. Muslims, Christians, Buddhists, and others were allowed to worship freely, as long as they paid their taxes and obeyed the laws. Religious leaders were often excused from taxation and given protection. This tolerance was practical. By allowing diversity, Genghis reduced resistance and gained the loyalty of many peoples. Yet Genghis's rule was not gentle. Justice was strict and punishments were severe. A man who betrayed his oath could be executed. A soldier who deserted in battle was killed along with his unit. Mercy was rare for those who defied him, but for those who obeyed, life under Mongol rule could be surprisingly stable. Farmers who once feared raids found their fields safer. Merchants who once lost goods to bandits now traveled in peace. The price of safety was submission, and many chose it. Genghis also looked ahead to the future of his family and empire. He gathered his sons and gave them territories to govern. But he also reminded them that unity was more important than pride. He feared that after his death, jealousy and rivalry might tear apart what he had built. He tried to prepare them with both warnings and instructions, though history would show that his fears were not unfounded. More than anything, Genghis Khan's vision was about discipline and unity. He knew that empires rose and fell, but he wanted the Mongols to endure by holding firm to their laws and their loyalty. He had seen what chaos did to tribes, how betrayal destroyed families, how weakness invited destruction. His system was harsh, but it was built to last. Even his enemies, when they surrendered, sometimes found themselves surprised by his fairness. Skilled craftsmen were spared and honored. Brave warriors, once defeated, could rise in rank if they swore loyalty. To Genghis, what mattered most was not where a man was born, but whether he could serve faithfully. In this, he was unlike many kings of his age. When we look at Genghis Khan's rule, we see not only the conqueror, but the organizer, the lawgiver, the builder of systems. His vision reached beyond battles. He created the foundations of an empire that would stretch across continents, touching more people than any empire before. The laws, the postal system, the protection of trade, the tolerance of religions, these were the pillars of his dream. For his people, he was more than a warlord. He was a ruler who gave them order, who lifted them from endless tribal wars into something larger. For his enemies, he was both feared and respected. And for history, he was a paradox. Ruthless destroyer and pragmatic builder, terror on the battlefield and lawgiver in council. The world of Genghis Khan was built on both the sword and the law. And as his empire expanded, it carried not only fire and arrows, but also systems that would outlive him. His rule was the foundation upon which the Mongol Empire would stand at its peak. When Genghis Khan died in 1227, the world he left behind was already vast. His empire stretched from the Pacific coast of China to the edges of Central Asia. Yet this was only the beginning. His death did not stop the storm. Instead, his successors carried his vision further, expanding the Mongol Empire into the largest land empire the world had ever seen. Before his death, Genghis made arrangements for succession. His sons had been given lands and responsibilities, but he chose Ögedei, his third son, as the Great Khan, the supreme ruler of all Mongols. Genghis had seen ambition and rivalry among his children and knew that unity was fragile. By naming Ögedei, who was known for his fairness and steady character, he hoped to keep peace among his heirs. For a time, it worked. Ögedei became Great Khan in 1229, and under his leadership, the Mongol armies continued to expand. One of the first great campaigns after Genghis's death was against the Jin dynasty of northern China, which had not yet been fully conquered. For years, the Jin had resisted, relying on their walls and fortresses, but the Mongols pressed on. In 1234, with the help of the Song dynasty in southern China, the Jin were finally crushed. Northern China came fully under Mongol control, adding vast farmlands, cities, and resources to the empire. But the Mongols were not content with victories in the east. Their eyes turned westward, toward the Islamic world and Europe. Under Ogeday's rule, great generals like Subutai and Batu Khan, a grandson of Genghis, led armies into Russia and beyond. The steppe horsemen rode across frozen rivers, through forests, and over mountains. In 1237, they struck the Principality of Ryazan, burning it to the ground. One by one, the Russian principalities fell. Cities like Vladimir and Moscow were looted, and Kiev, the ancient city on the Dnieper River, was destroyed in 1240. The Mongols had become the rulers of Russia, a domination that would last for centuries under what became known as the Golden Horde. From Russia, the Mongols pushed further into Europe. In 1241, they invaded Poland and Hungary. At the Battle of Liegnitz in Silesia, a combined European force of Poles, Germans, and knights of military orders faced the Mongols. They were crushed by Mongol discipline and tactics. That same year, at the Battle of Mohi in Hungary, the Mongols inflicted another devastating defeat. Europe trembled. For the first time, the knights of Christendom had faced the riders of the steppe and been utterly broken. Panic spread across the continent. From Rome to Paris, rulers feared the approach of the Mongols. Had they pressed further, perhaps Europe itself might have fallen. But fate intervened. In 1241, Ogedei Khan died. As was Mongol custom, all princes and generals had to return to Mongolia to elect a new great Khan. The advance into Europe stopped suddenly. The armies withdrew, leaving behind only fear and ruins. Europe had been spared, not by victory, but by the death of a single man thousands of miles away. While Batu Khan established the Golden Horde in Russia, other branches of the Mongol family took power elsewhere. In Persia and the Middle East, the Ilkhanate was founded by Hulagu, another grandson of Genghis. Hulagu's campaigns shook the Islamic world. In 1258, his armies captured Baghdad, the great center of the Abbasid Caliphate. The city, known as a jewel of learning and trade, was destroyed. Its libraries burned, its scholars killed, its people massacred. The fall of Baghdad marked the end of the Abbasid caliphs as temporal rulers. It was one of the most shocking events in Islamic history, remembered for centuries with sorrow. In China, another grandson, Kublai Khan, rose to prominence. Kublai was different from his grandfather. While Genghis and Ogedai had lived as steppe warriors, Kublai grew fascinated by Chinese culture. He surrounded himself with scholars and advisors, learning from Confucian traditions and Chinese administration. In 1271, he declared the founding of the Yuan dynasty, claiming the mandate of heaven, the Chinese belief that granted legitimacy to rulers. By 1279, his armies had defeated the southern Song dynasty, completing the conquest of all China. For the first time, all of China was under foreign rule. The Yuan dynasty would last for almost a century, blending Mongol and Chinese traditions. The Mongol Empire at its height stretched from Korea to Hungary, from Siberia to the Persian Gulf. Never before had so much of the world been under one rule. The empire was divided into Khanates, the Golden Horde in Russia, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Yuan dynasty in China. But all recognized the great Khan in Mongolia, at least in theory. Together, they formed a network that connected the East and West as never before. This period is sometimes called the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol Peace. Trade flourished along the Silk Road, protected by Mongol soldiers. Merchants carried goods safely across thousands of miles. Spices, silk, and porcelain moved west, while glass, silver, and textiles moved east. Along with goods came ideas, inventions, and travelers. The most famous of these was Marco Polo, the Venetian merchant who visited Kublai Khan's court and later described the wonders he saw in China. But beneath the glory of expansion, tensions already brewed. The Khanates grew more independent, and rivalries among the descendants of Genghis Khan began to surface. Different branches of the family had different interests, cultures, and ambitions. Unity, which had been the foundation of Mongol strength, slowly began to weaken. Still, in this age of expansion, the Mongols achieved what no empire before them had done. They connected the known world. From the steppes of Mongolia, messages could travel to Persia in weeks. Goods could move from China to Europe, and armies could strike across continents. The successors of Genghis Khan carried his vision further than he himself had lived to see. It was an age of both greatness and fear, of unmatched power and hidden cracks. The Mongols had risen higher than anyone thought possible. The question was how long such vastness could endure. When we think of the Mongol Empire, it is easy to imagine only battles. Horsemen riding across the steppe, cities burning and rulers trembling before the Khan's messengers. But life under the Mongols was more than war. Once the storms of conquest had passed, the empire settled into something new, a vast network of lands linked together by laws, roads, and order. For the first time in centuries, people from distant regions could travel, trade, and share ideas under the same roof of power. This period became known as the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace. The Pax Mongolica was not peace in the gentle sense. It was peace built on fear and obedience. Yet for merchants, scholars, and ordinary families, it brought a kind of stability that had been rare before. The Silk Road, once broken by bandits and rival states, became safe again. Caravans could move from China to Persia, from Russia to the Middle East, carrying silk, spices, glass, silver, and paper. Merchants carried stamped passports from the Khan himself, called paisi, which guaranteed them protection. To harm a merchant under Mongol protection was to risk death. With trade came prosperity. In Chinese markets, Persian glass sparkled. In Samarkand, merchants sold Chinese silk. In European towns, people marveled at stories of strange goods and inventions from the East. Ideas traveled too. Medicine, astronomy, mathematics, and philosophy crossed borders as easily as fabrics and spices. Technologies like gunpowder and printing slowly made their way westward, reshaping the world far beyond Mongol lands. Life within the empire varied depending on where you lived. In the steppes of Mongolia, people continued their nomadic traditions, herding animals and moving with the seasons. In the cities of China, daily life carried on much as before, though now under Mongol rulers. Farmers still worked the fields, artisans crafted goods, and scholars wrote books. In Persia, the Ilkhanate introduced new taxes and laws, but also supported artists and architects, leading to beautiful mosques and palaces. In Russia, under the Golden Horde, princes collected tribute for the Khan, and the Orthodox Church gained protection in exchange for loyalty. For ordinary people, the Mongols could be both feared and respected. Their taxes were heavy, but their protection was real. Roads were safer, markets busier, and wars fewer within the empire's borders. Many found that life under the Mongols, though harsh at times, was more predictable than life before, when rival kingdoms constantly clashed. Religion under Mongol rule was marked by tolerance. Genghis Khan and his successors did not force their faith on others. In China, Buddhism and Confucianism continued. In Persia, Islam thrived. In Russia, Christianity was allowed. The Mongols themselves practiced shamanism, but Khans often consulted with Muslim scholars, Buddhist monks, and Christian priests alike. Religious leaders were often excused from taxes and offered protection. This tolerance reduced rebellion and helped the Mongols govern lands of many different beliefs. Yet life under the Mongols was not free of hardship. Taxes could be crushing, and those who resisted were punished harshly. In times of rebellion, entire towns could still be destroyed. The memory of Mongol cruelty lingered, even as their order brought stability. Some families saw the Pax Mongolica as safety, others saw it as submission. One of the most remarkable aspects of Mongol rule was the postal system, known as the yam. Relay stations with fresh horses were placed along major routes, allowing messages to travel at incredible speed. A letter could cross thousands of miles in weeks instead of months. These stations also gave food and shelter to merchants and officials, making travel easier across vast distances. It was the nervous system of the empire, carrying orders from the Khan and news from one end of Eurasia to the other. Travelers who journeyed through Mongol lands often marveled at what they saw. The most famous was Marco Polo, a Venetian merchant who spent years at the court of Kublai Khan in China. He described the wealth of the Yuan dynasty, the size of Chinese cities, and the wonders of the empire. His stories, though sometimes exaggerated, amazed Europeans and fueled curiosity about the East. Cultural exchange was another result of Mongol rule. Art, literature, and science moved across borders. In Persia, Mongol rulers sponsored poets and scholars. In China, they built new capitals, blending steppe traditions with Chinese architecture. In Central Asia, cities like Samarkand and Bukhara flourished as crossroads of trade and culture. Even food recipes and clothing styles spread along the routes. The empire, though born in war, became a bridge between worlds. But this exchange also carried dangers. Along with goods and ideas, diseases traveled. The most deadly was the plague, which spread along Mongol trade routes from Asia to Europe, leading to the Black Death of the 14th century. The same roads that carried silk and spices also carried death, showing how deeply connected the world had become under Mongol rule. For ordinary people, daily life often depended on the wisdom or cruelty of local rulers. Some Mongol governors were fair, encouraging trade and protecting their subjects. Others were greedy, demanding heavy tribute and showing little mercy. The experience of life under the empire was not the same everywhere, but one truth was clear. The Mongols had reshaped the map of the world. The Pax Mongolica did not last forever. As unity among the Khanates weakened, wars returned, roads became less safe, and the vast network began to fray. But for a time, under the shadow of Mongol rule, the world was more connected than it had ever been. It was a time of fear and opportunity, of cruelty and exchange, of destruction and creation. Life under the Mongols cannot be painted in only one color. For some, it was an age of safety, wealth, and discovery. For others, it was an age of oppression, loss, and fear. But for history, it was an age that bound together the corners of the world, leaving a legacy that would shape centuries to come. The Mongol Empire at its height seemed unstoppable. From the Yellow Sea to the Black Sea, from the forests of Russia to the deserts of Persia, its banner stretched across continents. Roads were safe, trade flourished, and the name of the Khan carried both fear and respect. Yet even as the empire looked strongest, small cracks began to appear beneath the surface. These cracks, at first invisible, would grow into fractures that no amount of conquest could heal. One of the greatest challenges was the problem of succession. Genghis Khan had chosen his son Ogedei as Great Khan, but after Ogedei's death, unity became harder to maintain. Each branch of the family wanted power. Brothers, uncles, sons, and cousins all saw themselves as rightful rulers. In theory, a Great Khan was elected at a council called a Kurultai, but in practice, rival factions often fought bitterly before agreeing on a leader. The more the empire grew, the harder it was to keep all princes loyal to one center of power in Mongolia. The distance itself was another problem. The empire was simply too vast. Orders sent from the Great Khan could take weeks to reach distant lands. By the time a command arrived in Persia or Russia, local rulers had often already acted on their own judgment. This independence slowly weakened the authority of the central court. Over time, the great unity that Genghis had forged gave way to four main Khanates: the Yuan dynasty in China, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Golden Horde in Russia. Though they all claimed loyalty to the Great Khan, each grew more independent in practice. Differences in culture also deepened the cracks. The Mongols had once been united by the simple life of the steppe, with shared customs and traditions. But as they settled in conquered lands, they absorbed new ways. In Persia, Mongol rulers converted to Islam and adopted Persian customs. In China, Kublai Khan embraced Chinese traditions and declared the Yuan dynasty. In Russia, the Golden Horde allowed local princes and the Orthodox Church to grow in power. These adaptations helped the Mongols rule, but they also pulled the empire in different directions, making unity harder to maintain. Economics also became a strain. Conquest had filled Mongol coffers with loot, tribute, and slaves. But conquest could not last forever. As expansion slowed, so did the flow of wealth. Maintaining vast armies and garrisons became expensive. Taxes grew heavier, and resentment among subject peoples increased. Merchants thrived under Mongol protection, but farmers often bore the burden of taxation. Rebellions flared in provinces where the weight of tribute grew too heavy. Even within the ruling family, mistrust grew. Alliances shifted. Brothers turned against brothers, and cousins plotted against cousins. The unity that had once made the Mongols invincible became fragile. Civil wars broke out between Khanates, weakening the empire just as new enemies grew stronger on its borders. Another crack came from the very success of the empire's openness. The Silk Road brought goods, knowledge, and people across the world, but it also carried disease. In the mid-14th century, the plague spread from Asia into Europe along Mongol trade routes. The Black Death devastated populations across continents, killing millions. The same roads that had made the empire strong now carried death, weakening towns, armies, and economies. The image of Mongol invincibility also began to fade. In the Middle East, the Mongols were defeated by the Mamluks at the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260. It was the first time that a major Mongol army had been stopped in open battle. The myth of unstoppable conquest cracked, and enemies learned that the Mongols could be resisted. In Japan, typhoons destroyed Mongol invasion fleets, remembered as the Divine Wind or Kamikaze. These failures showed limits to Mongol power. Within China, resentment of Mongol rule grew. Kublai Khan and his successors had tried to blend Mongol and Chinese systems, but many Chinese felt humiliated under foreign rulers. Heavy taxes, corruption, and favoritism toward Mongols and foreigners deepened anger. Revolts simmered and eventually erupted, paving the way for the fall of the Yuan dynasty. The Golden Horde in Russia also faced problems. At first, Russian princes submitted and paid tribute, but over time, they grew stronger. Moscow, once a small town, rose in power and began to challenge Mongol authority. The balance of power slowly shifted, weakening the horde's grip. Despite these cracks, the Mongol Empire did not collapse overnight. For decades, it remained a vast and powerful system. Trade continued, cultures mixed, and armies still struck fear. But the signs were clear. Unity was breaking, expansion had ended, and the empire was beginning to settle into decline. The story of the Mongols shows how even the strongest empires can be undone not by a single blow, but by slow fractures from within. Succession disputes, cultural divisions, economic strain, disease, and resistance all combined to weaken what once seemed eternal. The cracks did not destroy the empire at once, but they made its fall only a matter of time. When Kublai Khan declared the Yuan dynasty in 1271, it marked a turning point in Mongol history. For the first time, the Mongols ruled all of China, claiming the mandate of heaven, the ancient belief that gave legitimacy to emperors. The Yuan dynasty stood as proof that the Mongols were no longer only warriors of the steppe. They had become emperors of one of the greatest civilizations in the world, but greatness also brought challenges. The Yuan dynasty rose in splendor, yet within a century it began to sink under the weight of rebellion, corruption, and discontent. At first, the Yuan thrived. Kublai Khan built a new capital at Khanbalik, the city we know today as Beijing. He invited scholars, engineers, and artisans from across the empire. Roads and canals were repaired, trade flourished, and new palaces rose. The dynasty connected China more closely with the outside world than ever before. Merchants from Persia, India, and even Europe walked its streets. Marco Polo described the wealth of Yuan China with awe, speaking of bustling markets, beautiful buildings, and vast riches. But beneath this glittering surface, tensions grew. The Mongols, though rulers of China, were still foreigners. They kept themselves apart from the majority of the Chinese population. Mongols were placed at the top of the social order, followed by Central Asians and other foreigners, while the native Chinese were placed below. Important government posts often went to outsiders rather than Chinese scholars. This system bred resentment. The proud Chinese literati, long used to serving emperors, now found themselves excluded and humiliated. Taxes also became a heavy burden. Maintaining the empire, its armies, and its palaces demanded wealth. Farmers, already struggling with floods and famine, were pressed to pay more. Corruption spread among officials, who took bribes and abused their power. For peasants, life under the Yuan often felt harsher than under previous dynasties. Rebellions simmered in the countryside, waiting for a spark to ignite them. Natural disasters added to the troubles. Floods of the Yellow River destroyed farmland and homes. Droughts caused famine in other regions. When disasters struck, people often saw them as signs that the rulers had lost the mandate of heaven. For many, the suffering of the land was proof that the Yuan dynasty was no longer favored by the skies. In the later years, the Yuan court became weaker. Successors of Kublai Khan lacked his strength and vision. Factional struggles broke out within the royal family. Some emperors spent more time on luxury and hunting than on governing. Military campaigns drained resources without bringing lasting gains. The once mighty Yuan began to look fragile. In the 14th century, large rebellions broke out. Secret societies and peasant groups organized uprisings, the most famous being the Red Turban Rebellion. These rebels combined religious movements with anger over heavy taxes and foreign rule. They spread across the countryside, seizing towns and challenging Mongol authority. One of the leaders who rose from these rebellions was Zhu Yuanzhang, the son of a poor peasant family. After years of struggle, he gathered followers, defeated rivals, and pushed the Mongols out of China. In 1368, he declared the founding of the Ming dynasty. The Yuan court fled north, retreating back to the steppes of Mongolia. The Mongols, who had once ruled all of China, now lost it. The fall of the Yuan dynasty marked the end of Mongol rule in China. For the Chinese people, it was a moment of triumph, a return to native rule after nearly a century under foreigners. For the Mongols, it was a bitter loss. The dream of ruling China, the richest land of all, slipped away. Yet even in decline, the Yuan left a mark. They had connected China with the wider world, opening trade and cultural exchange on a scale never seen before. They had introduced new ideas, foods, and technologies. The Mongol era, though short, shaped China's place in global history. The decline of the Yuan was part of a larger story, the weakening of the Mongol Empire as a whole. As the Yuan fell, other Khanates also faced troubles. The unity of Genghis Khan's vision had long since broken. The cracks had become deep wounds. The Mongol storm that had once shaken the world was now fading into history. The Mongol Empire had spread like a storm across Asia, and one of its most powerful branches was the Ilkhanate in Persia. Founded by Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis, it stretched across Iran, Iraq, and parts of Anatolia. At its height, the Ilkhanate stood as a bridge between East and West, linking Mongol rule with the Islamic world. Yet like other parts of the empire, it would not last forever. The Ilkhanate rose quickly, burned brightly, and then fell into weakness and ruin. Hulagu created the Ilkhanate after his famous campaign in the Middle East. In 1258, his armies captured Baghdad, the great capital of the Abbasid Caliphate. The city was devastated, its libraries destroyed, its people slaughtered. For the Islamic world, it was one of the darkest days in memory. But for Hulagu, it was a triumph, and from the ashes, he built his new state. His court was based first in Maraga and later in Tabriz, where he gathered scholars, craftsmen, and administrators to organize his new realm. At first, the Ilkhanate was strong. Hulagu brought order to Persia after years of war. Roads were repaired, trade flourished, and taxes filled his treasury. The empire became a center for science and art. Hulagu himself supported scholars and invited foreign visitors. The observatory at Maraga, built under his orders, became one of the finest centers of astronomy in the world. But the Ilkhanate faced difficulties from the beginning. Unlike China, where the Mongols could rule a majority population with clear authority, Persia was a land of many cultures and faiths. Muslims, Christians, Jews, and Buddhists lived under its rule. The Mongols themselves had their own traditions. Hulagu favored Buddhism and shamanism, while his Persian subjects were overwhelmingly Muslim. This created tension. Although he tolerated Islam, many Muslims saw him as a destroyer, especially after Baghdad's fall. Later rulers tried to mend this rift. Ghazan Khan, who came to power in 1295, converted to Islam. His conversion was a turning point. It gave him legitimacy in the eyes of his subjects and helped reduce rebellion. Ghazan also reformed the empire. He improved taxation, cracked down on corruption, and supported agriculture. He encouraged scholars and historians, leading to new works that preserved knowledge. For a time, the Ilkhanate was stable and prosperous under his rule. But stability did not last. After Ghazan's death, his successors were weaker. Some were children when they took the throne. Others were controlled by ambitious nobles. Rival factions at court fought for power, weakening central authority. Corruption spread once more, and local governors became more independent. The unity that had made the Ilkhanate strong began to crumble. External enemies also pressed on its borders. The Mamluks of Egypt, who had defeated the Mongols at Ain Jalut in 1260, continued to resist in Syria. The Golden Horde to the north was often hostile, and wars with them drained resources. Even within the wider Mongol family, alliances shifted, and the Ilkhanate could not always rely on support from other Khanates. Economics grew worse as well. Heavy taxation, combined with natural disasters like drought and famine, made life hard for peasants. Trade along the Silk Road was still important, but the empire's wealth no longer grew as it had in the early years. Discontent among the people rose steadily. The final blow came in the mid-14th century. In 1335, Abu Sa'id, the last strong Ilkhan, died without an heir. With no clear successor, the Ilkhanate splintered. Rival claimants fought for the throne, but none had the strength to unite the realm. Governors and warlords declared independence. Persia fell into a period of fragmentation, with small states rising and falling in quick succession. The once powerful Ilkhanate had collapsed. In less than a century, it had gone from Hulagu's mighty conquest to Abu Sa'id's death and dissolution. The Mongol storm in Persia had passed. Yet the Ilkhanate left a legacy. It brought new connections between East and West. It supported scholarship, astronomy, and history. The works written during this time, such as those of historian Rashid al-Din, remain valuable records of Mongol and Persian history. And its rulers, especially Ghazan Khan, showed how the Mongols could adapt to local cultures, blending their traditions with those of the lands they ruled. The fall of the Ilkhanate was part of the larger story of Mongol decline. Just as the UN in China weakened, and the Golden Horde faced challenges in Russia, the Ilkhanate's collapse showed that even the mightiest conquests could not hold forever. Unity was gone, and the great empire of Genghis Khan was breaking into pieces. For the people of Persia, the fall meant more years of division and war. But for history, the Ilkhanate stands as both a warning and a lesson that even the strongest empires must find balance between conquest and governance, between foreign rulers and local traditions. The Mongols had brought both terror and order, both destruction and creation. In Persia, their time ended, but their mark remained. The Golden Horde was one of the most famous branches of the Mongol Empire. Founded by Batu Khan, grandson of Genghis, it ruled over the vast lands of Russia, the steppe north of the Black Sea, and parts of Eastern Europe. For nearly 2 centuries, the Golden Horde held power, collecting tribute, controlling trade, and striking fear into its neighbors. Yet, like the other Mongol states, it could not last forever. The story of the Golden Horde is one of early strength, long dominance, and slow decline. The Golden Horde began in the 1240s, after Batu Khan led the great Mongol invasion of Europe. Russian cities like Kiev, Vladimir, and Moscow were burned or forced into submission. Princes who survived had no choice but to bow to Mongol power. The Horde established its capital at Sarai on the Volga River, a city that grew into one of the largest in the medieval world. From Sarai, the Khans ruled a diverse land of Russians, Tatars, Turks, and others. At its height, the Golden Horde was both feared and respected. Russian princes had to pay tribute each year, traveling to Sarai to present gifts and money. Those who resisted were punished harshly. Those who submitted were allowed to keep their thrones. The Orthodox Church was protected and even exempted from taxes, which helped it grow in influence. In this way, the Horde ruled indirectly, allowing local rulers to govern, but keeping ultimate authority in Mongol hands. Trade also flourished under the Horde. The Volga River and the Black Sea became busy routes for merchants. Goods flowed from Asia to Europe, carried safely under Mongol protection. Sarai itself became a cosmopolitan city, with markets full of goods from every corner of the empire. The Pax Mongolica reached even these distant lands, bringing wealth as well as power. But the seeds of decline were already present. The Golden Horde, like other Khanates, was a family state. Succession disputes weakened it again and again. When a Khan died, rival princes fought for the throne, sometimes drawing in outside powers like the Ilkhanate or the Chagatai Khanate. Civil wars drained strength and made the Horde vulnerable. Another challenge came from the very people they ruled. At first, Russian princes were weak, forced to serve the Khans, but over time they grew stronger. Moscow in particular rose as a new center of power. Its princes were clever, paying tribute when necessary, but slowly building their own strength. They became intermediaries between the Mongols and other Russian lands, gaining wealth and influence. By the 14th century, Moscow was preparing to challenge Mongol rule. The Horde also faced external enemies. To the west, the rising power of Lithuania pressed into its lands. To the south, the Mamluks of Egypt resisted Mongol influence. To the east, the Timurids under Tamerlane struck devastating blows. In 1395, Tamerlane defeated the Horde in battle, sacking Sarai and burning its cities. This was a wound from which the Horde never fully recovered. Religion added another layer of change. In the 14th century, many of the Horde's rulers converted to Islam. This helped strengthen ties with Muslim lands and gave the Khans new legitimacy among their Turkic subjects. But it also created tension with their Orthodox Christian vassals in Russia. The once stable balance between Mongol rulers and Russian princes began to shift. By the 15th century, the Golden Horde was breaking apart. Rival Khans claimed authority, and smaller khanates emerged from its lands, such as the Crimean Khanate, the Kazan Khanate, and the Astrakhan Khanate. Each sought independence, and the unity of the horde dissolved. The final blow came from Russia itself. In 1480, Ivan III of Moscow refused to pay tribute. At the Ugra River, Russian and Mongol armies faced each other, but no battle was fought. Instead, the Mongols withdrew, and with that, the Tatar yoke was broken. Russia was free, and the Golden Horde was finished as a great power. The decline of the Golden Horde was not a single fall, but a long unraveling. Civil wars, foreign invasions, rising rivals, and internal divisions all chipped away at its strength. What had once been a mighty branch of Genghis Khan's empire became only memories and smaller states. Yet the horde left a lasting mark. For Russia, its rule shaped politics, society, and identity. Tribute had drained wealth, but Mongol systems of administration and military organization influenced Russian rulers. The Orthodox Church grew stronger under Mongol protection, and Moscow rose as the heir to both Russian traditions and Mongol methods of power. In many ways, the shadow of the Golden Horde stretched long after its decline. The story of the Golden Horde's fall fits into the wider pattern of Mongol history. Like the Yuan in China and the Ilkhanate in Persia, it rose quickly, ruled powerfully, and then fractured under its own weight. The unity of Genghis Khan's vision could not be kept across centuries. The cracks that began in succession disputes and cultural differences ended in full collapse. Still, for nearly 2 centuries, the Golden Horde shaped the destiny of Eastern Europe and Russia. Its decline was not the end of Mongol influence, but it was the fading of one of the most powerful lights of the empire. From then on, the world would remember the Horde as both conqueror and overlord, a force that changed history but could not escape the fate of all empires. The fall of the Mongol Empire did not erase its legacy. When the unity forged by Genghis Khan collapsed, new powers rose from its ruins. These successor states carried pieces of Mongol heritage while building identities of their own. Some lasted for centuries, others only for decades. But together, they shaped the transition from the age of empire to the world that followed. In Russia, the vacuum left by the decline of the Golden Horde gave birth to independent khanates. The Crimean Khanate became the most influential. Established in the 15th century, it allied itself with the Ottoman Empire and remained a major power on the Black Sea for centuries. Its cavalry raids reached deep into Eastern Europe, reminding neighbors that steppe riders had not vanished. The Kazan and Astrakhan Khanates also emerged, ruling over parts of the Volga region. Eventually, these states were conquered by the expanding power of Moscow, but their cultural influence lived on in the Tatar peoples of Russia. In Central Asia, the Chagatai Khanate endured, though often divided by internal struggles. Some regions adopted Islam deeply, blending Mongol traditions with local faith and culture. The Chagatai Khanate did not remain a single strong power, but it acted as a bridge between East and West, keeping alive the Mongol memory in Central Asia. From its lands would later rise new conquerors, including Timur, known in the West as Tamerlane, who dreamed of rebuilding an empire even greater than the Mongols. In Persia and the Middle East, the fall of the Ilkhanate left chaos, but out of that chaos, new dynasties rose. Local rulers, once Mongol governors or generals, claimed independence. Some sought to keep ties with Mongol traditions, while others turned fully toward Islam and Persian culture. Over time, the Timurid Empire emerged, blending Mongol military heritage with Persian art, science, and architecture. Cities like Samarkand shone brightly under Timur's rule, carrying echoes of the Mongol past into a new age of splendor. China saw perhaps the most dramatic transformation. When the Yuan dynasty collapsed in 1368, the Ming dynasty rose. The Ming were determined to erase the humiliation of foreign rule. They restored Chinese traditions, rebuilt walls, and celebrated their independence. Yet even as they pushed the Mongols back into the steppe, the Ming carried forward lessons from their time under Mongol rule. They strengthened trade, organized postal systems, and adapted military tactics. The Ming dynasty would become one of the strongest in Chinese history, but its foundations carried marks of the Mongol experience. Elsewhere, Mongol influence lingered in subtle ways. In India, the Delhi Sultanate absorbed refugees, soldiers, and administrators shaped by Mongol rule. Centuries later, the Mughal Empire, whose very name came from Mongol, would rise, blending Central Asian and Indian traditions into one of the great dynasties of South Asia. The Mongol story had not ended. It had transformed. The successor states also carried Mongol influence in culture and language. Turkic and Mongolic tongues blended in many regions, creating new dialects and identities. Architecture showed the steppe style mixed with Islamic and Chinese designs. Legal traditions, such as the Mongol emphasis on order and postal communication, left lasting marks on how rulers governed. But perhaps the greatest legacy of these states was the memory of empire itself. Even after the Mongol political power had fractured, rulers across Eurasia remembered the vision of Genghis Khan, a vision of vast dominion, strict discipline, and relentless expansion. Many tried to imitate it, but few succeeded. The rise of successor states also showed the limits of conquest. The Mongols had united lands across continents, but without strong institutions, the unity could not survive. Local cultures, religions, and traditions were too strong to be erased. Instead, they absorbed and reshaped Mongol rule into new forms. In this way, the successors were both children of the empire and proof of its limits. By the 15th century, the age of the unified Mongol Empire was over. In its place stood a mosaic of new states, some mighty, some fragile, but all carrying the imprint of the storm that had once swept across the world. The rise of these states reminds us that history does not end with collapse. From endings come beginnings, and from ruins come new powers. The Mongol Empire faded, but its echoes lived on in the nations that followed. The Mongol Empire has long since faded, but its shadow still stretches across history. For little more than a century, it was the greatest power on earth, larger than Rome, larger than Alexander's empire, stretching across deserts, mountains, rivers, and seas. Born from the vision of a boy on the steppe, it grew into a storm that shook civilizations and reshaped the world. Its legacy is complex, both terrible and extraordinary, filled with destruction and creation, cruelty and tolerance, endings and beginnings. One of the greatest legacies of the Mongols was the scale of their conquests. No other empire before or since has connected so much of the world through land. From the Pacific shores of China to the plains of Hungary, from the frozen rivers of Russia to the deserts of Persia, the Mongols ruled or influenced nearly all of Eurasia. They showed that no barrier, not distance, not climate, not walls, could resist the discipline of their armies. This memory haunted neighbors for centuries. Even when their empire collapsed, the fear of Mongol riders lived on in legend. Yet the Mongols were not only destroyers, they also became great connectors. Their empire linked east and west in a way that had never been done before. Under the Pax Mongolica, trade along the Silk Road flourished. Merchants traveled with safety, carrying silk, spices, glass, furs, and metals across continents. For the first time in history, a caravan could leave China and arrive in Europe under the protection of one authority. Goods, money, and knowledge flowed freely. This flow of knowledge may be the most lasting gift of the Mongols. Ideas in medicine, astronomy, mathematics, and engineering moved across their lands. Paper, printing, and gunpowder made their way west, eventually changing Europe forever. At the same time, inventions and techniques from the West reached the East. Without Mongol networks, the exchange of ideas that fueled the Renaissance might have been slower, perhaps even impossible. Religious tolerance was another part of their legacy. While many empires forced one faith, the Mongols generally allowed diversity. In their courts, shamans, Muslims, Buddhists, and Christians debated side by side. Religious leaders often received protection and freedom from taxes. This policy reduced rebellion and allowed cultures to keep their identity under Mongol rule. It also left behind a tradition of tolerance in some successor states. The Mongols also changed warfare forever. Their use of mobility, discipline, and psychological terror became lessons studied by generals long after. The system of decimal organization, tens, hundreds, thousands, 10,000s, gave their armies structure. Their use of feigned retreats and ambushes showed new levels of cunning. They combined steppe speed with the siege technology of China and Persia, creating a war machine without equal. Armies across the world adapted, copying what they could, but their legacy was also one of destruction. Cities like Nishapur, Baghdad, and Zhongdu suffered devastation so great that their scars lasted for generations. Populations were wiped out, libraries burned, and cultural treasures lost forever. To many, the Mongols were remembered not as bringers of order, but as punishers. A whirlwind of death sent by heaven for the sins of mankind. The grief of those losses echoes through history. For Russia, the Mongol legacy was the Tatar yoke, 2 centuries of tribute that drained wealth, but also shaped political systems. Moscow rose under Mongol influence, learning methods of taxation, control, and centralization that later formed the foundation of the Russian state. For China, the Yuan dynasty was a humiliation, yet it also left behind infrastructure, connections, and lessons that influenced the Ming. For Persia, the Ilkhanate brought both devastation and a flowering of scholarship. The memory of Mongol destruction remained bitter, yet their cultural exchanges left marks still visible today. The Mongol Empire also left a human legacy in bloodlines. Across Eurasia, Mongol rulers married into local families. Descendants of Genghis Khan claimed thrones in Persia, India, and Central Asia. The Mughal emperors of India, for example, trace their line back to both Timur and Genghis. In this way, the empire lived on not only in memory, but in people. Even the fall of the empire left lessons. It showed how power, no matter how vast, cannot survive without unity. The cracks of succession disputes, cultural divisions, and economic strain destroyed what conquest had built. The Mongols rose with discipline and fell with division. This truth has been studied by rulers ever since. Today, the legacy of the Mongols is debated. In some places, they are remembered as monsters, destroyers of cities, killers of millions. In others, they are admired as visionaries, builders of networks, and champions of order. Both are true. They were the sword and the bridge, the fire and the foundation. They remind us that history is never simple. Perhaps the greatest legacy is the reminder of what one vision can achieve. A boy named Temujin, born into hardship on the Mongolian steppe, united his people, forged an empire, and reshaped the world. He showed that the fate of nations can turn on a single life. His empire did not last, but the world it left behind was forever changed. The Mongol Empire ended as all empires do, but its echo still whispers in languages, in cultures, in the flow of ideas, in the rise of states that came after. The dust of its riders has long since settled, but the glory of its story endures.